Good morning, everyone. If you would, please make your way to your seats. We're about to begin our Genesis class. Today's our third meeting of Genesis. And I've been spending a lot of time on some basic introductory stuff. And hopefully from this point on, we'll get the pace moving just a little bit quicker. All right. So let me get my clicker and we'll get underway. All right, before we begin, or maybe kind of as a summary, I already told you I guess it was the first day, that there's two major divisions in Genesis. 1 through 11 is very general for all humanity. And beginning with chapter 12, you have the call of Abraham, and at that point, we're focusing on this man of faith and his descendants, and how eventually God brought the Messiah into the world. And so for other classes, you may have seen these videos put out by the Bible Project, which I really like. It's kind of a comic book version, but they do a great job illustrating the key points and gives you an overview. This one will give you, the one I'll show you today, will give you an overview of chapters 1 through 11. And in fact, they do a great job. They even bring out some aspects or points that I really hadn't thought about before. So let's go ahead and play it now, and we'll see what you think. It's about 7 minutes or so. Okay, go ahead, Robert.
The book of Genesis is the first book of the Bible, and its storyline divides into two main parts. There's chapters 1 through 11, which tell the story of God and the whole world. And then there's chapters 12 through 50, which zoom in and tell the story of God and just one man, Abraham, and then his family. And these two parts are connected by a hinge story at the beginning of chapter 12. And this design, it gives us a clue to how to understand the message of the book as a whole and how it introduces the story of the whole Bible. So the book begins with God taking the disorder and the darkness described in the second sentence of the Bible, and God brings out of it order and beauty and goodness. He makes a world where life can flourish. And God makes these creatures called humans, or Adam in Hebrew. He makes them in his image, which has to do with their role and purpose in God's world. So the humans are made to be reflections of God's character out into the world, and they're appointed as God's representatives to rule his world on his behalf, which in context means to harness all of its potential, to care for it, and make it a place where even more life can flourish. God blesses the humans. It's a key word in this book. And he gives them a garden. It's like a place from which they begin starting to build this new world. Now, the key is that the humans have a choice about how they're going to go about building this world. And that's represented by the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Up till now, God has provided and defined what is good and what is not good. But now God is giving the humans the dignity and the freedom of a choice. Are they going to trust God's definition of good and evil, or are they going to seize autonomy and define good and evil for themselves? And the stakes are really high. To rebel against God is to embrace death, because you're turning away from the giver of life himself. This is represented by the tree of life. And so in chapter 3, a mysterious figure, a snake, enters into the story. The snake's given no introduction other than it's a creature that God made. And it becomes clear that it's a creature in rebellion against God, and it wants to lead the humans into rebellion and their death. The snake tells a different story about the tree and the choice. It says that seizing the knowledge of good and evil are not going to bring death, that it's actually the way to life and becoming like God themselves. Now, the irony of this is tragic, because we know the humans, they're already like God. They were made to reflect God's image. But instead of trusting God, the humans seize autonomy, they take the knowledge of good and evil for themselves, and in an instant, the whole story spirals out of control. The first casualty is human relationships. The man and the woman, they suddenly realize how vulnerable they are. Now, they can't even trust each other. And so they make clothes and they hide their bodies from one another. The second casualty is that intimacy between God and the humans is lost. So they go and run and hide from God, and then when God finds them, they start this game of blame shifting about who rebelled first. Now, right here, the story stops, and there's a series of short poems where God declares to the snake and then to the humans the tragic consequences of their actions. God first tells the snake that despite its apparent victory, it is destined for defeat, to eat dust. God promises that one day a seed or a descendant will come from the woman who's going to deliver a lethal strike to the snake's head, which sounds like great news, but this victory is going to come with a cost because the snake too will deliver a lethal strike to the descendant's heel as it's being crushed. It's a very mysterious promise of this wounded victor. But in the flow of the story so far, you see this is an act of God's grace. The humans, they've just rebelled, and what does God do? He promises to rescue them. But this doesn't erase the consequences of the humans' decision. So God informs them that now every aspect of their life together, at home and out in the field, it's going to be fraught with grief and pain because of the rebellion, all leading to their death. From here, the story then spirals downward. Chapters 3 through 11, they trace the widening ripple effect of the rebellion and of human relationships fracturing at every level. So there's a story about two brothers, Cain and Abel. Cain's so jealous of his brother that he wants to murder him. And God warns him not to give in to the temptation, but he does anyway. He murders him in the field. So Cain then goes on to build a city where violence and oppression reign. And this is all epitomized in the story of Lamech. He's the first man in the Bible to have more than one wife. He's accumulating them like property. And then he goes on to sing a short song about how he's more violent and vengeful than Cain ever was. After this, we get an odd story about the sons of God, which could refer to evil angelic beings, or it could refer to ancient kings who claimed that they descended from the gods. And like Lamech, they acquire as many wives as they wanted, and they produce the Nephilim, these great warriors of old. Whichever view is right, the point is that humans are building kingdoms that fill God's world with violence and even more corruption. In response, we're told that God is broken with grief. Humanity is ruining his good world, and they're ruining each other. And so out of a passion to protect the goodness of his world, he washes it clean of humanity's evil with a great flood. But he protects one blameless human, Noah, and his family, and he commissions him as a new Adam. He repeats the divine blessing and commissions him to go out into the world. And so our hopes are really high, but then Noah fails too, and also in a garden. He goes and he plants a vineyard, and he gets drunk out of his mind. And then one of his sons, Ham, does something shameful to his father in the tent. And so here we have our new Adam, naked and ashamed, just like the first, and the downward spiral begins again. It all leads to the foundation of the city of Babylon. The people of ancient Mesopotamia, they come together around this new technology they have, the brick. And they can make cities and towers bigger and faster than anybody's ever done before. And they want to build a new kind of tower that will reach up to the gods, and they will make a great name for themselves. It's an image of human rebellion and arrogance. It's the garden rebellion now writ large. And so God humbles their pride and scatters them. Now, this is a diverse group of stories, but you can see they're all exploring the same basic point. God keeps giving humans the chance to do the right thing with his world, and humans keep ruining it. These stories are making a claim that we live in a good world that we have turned bad, that we've all chosen to define good and evil for ourselves, and so we all contribute to this world of broken relationships, leading to conflict and violence and ultimately death. But there's hope. God promised that one day a descendant would come, the wounded victor who will defeat evil at its source. And so despite humanity's evil, God is determined to bless and rescue his world. And so the big question, of course, is what is God going to do? And the next story, The Hinge, offers the answer. But for now, that's what Genesis 1 through 11 is all about.
All right. Well, I think he does a great job giving us an overview of those first 11 chapters of Genesis and gives us some really good insights. So I've been spending a lot of time on Genesis chapter 1, and as I said, it's really, when it comes to Christian evidences and people attacking the veracity of the Bible, a lot of it is focused on things that happen in Genesis, especially in those first 11 chapters, and that's one of the reasons I want to spend a little bit more time on this. So we're going to try to finish up the 6 days of creation and get us into the creation of man and Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. All right, on day 2, you have God creating an expanse. And, we don't really understand exactly what that old world was like, but it looks like God took the waters of the ocean and he put some of that water up in the atmosphere. And I read somewhere an incredible statistic as to how much water vapor is actually contained in the earth, and like how much it would actually weigh if you could take all that water vapor and boil it down. And it's interesting because I teach this, when I teach meteorology to my students, we cover this about water vapor and how pretty much almost all water vapor is like in the bottom, I want to say like the bottom, say 4 or 5 miles, and above that it's pretty dry. But anyway, so God created this separation. Some versions call it the firmament. And then on day 3, that's when God created dry land and plants. So he really did two separate acts here. And at the completion of each of these, he said it was good. So dry land, what he did, it sounds like the earth was just like a ball of rock, but it's covered with water. And at some point, he must have raised up certain land masses, which would then make the water go down to the lower elevation. So that's what he did. And then on day 4, God created the cosmos, all the items that we see in space. And the purpose, and if you read this section, what I get out of there's like 3 main purposes. One, of course, was to give light. Now, on day 1, God created light, which I said was broadly was probably electromagnetic energy, but it wasn't necessarily being used to illuminate anything at that point. And here on day 4, he's actually using to give light. And along with that, it can be used to separate the daytime from the nighttime. Excuse me. All right. And then the second thing is really to give us kind of like markings for different time periods. For example, at its most basic, you could separate daytime and nighttime, also for marking the various seasons. So we have the spring and fall equinoxes, and we have the summer and the winter solstice. In fact, we're coming up on the winter solstice in about a week. And for marking various holidays, because we know when we get into the Jewish period that there are a number of holidays, festivals, that were based on different times of the year and looking at the motion of the moon and the earth and so on, and also marking special days of the year and also just counting the years. And then finally, it doesn't say a lot, but it says something about signs that if you think about it, at least in the Old Testament, there are a number of times where God used celestial events as a sign, and oftentimes in the prophetic literature, it often makes reference to things, for example, like the sun being darkened or the moon being turned to blood, but it's used in different ways. So for all of those, and when God was done with it, he also said that was good. Before we leave this, I want us to get I just want to get us some idea of how vast and limitless God is. The universe is his home. So how big is the universe? Well, I'll see if I can give you kind of an idea. We really don't know, but I can tell you what we do know, or what we think we know. From what I've read, the observable universe, in other words, what we're able to detect with our eyes and our scientific instruments, the observable universe is more than 46 billion light years in any direction from the Earth. which means what we can fit or what we can detect would fit within a sphere that's about 93 billion light years around. You know, if you look at all directions, it's about 93 billion light years from one side to the other. Now, I'm going to try to see if I can help you relate to like how big that 93 billion is. Light travels at about 186,000 miles per second, a little bit more than that, but we don't have to be real exact here. So what that means is in just 1 second, light could travel around Earth's equator 7.5 times. In 1 second, 7.5 times. And I've never been around the equator, but I know it's pretty big. It would take me a while to walk around it or drive around it if I could. Now, as fast as that is, it still takes about a little over 8 minutes for light from the sun to reach Earth. Think about that, how far that is. Okay, now, I mentioned like in 1 second how it could go like 7.5 times around the equator. Imagine, say, how far it would go not just in 8 minutes, like from the sun, but maybe how about 8 days? If at that kind of a speed, how far could you go in 8 days? How far could you go at that speed in 8 weeks? How about 8 months? 8 years? 800 years? 8,000 years? 8 million years? 8 billion years? Or 93 billion years? I'm hoping you get the idea. It's just like beyond human comprehension, how big that is. But I want to emphasize, as great as our scientific instruments are, that's as far as we are able to see. Maybe someday we'll be able to detect objects a little bit farther than that. But even then, that won't be the end, will it? That's not like that's the edge of the universe just because that's as far as we can see. So as far as we can tell, what we call space goes on for infinity, which is, again, that's a hard concept for us to grasp, but it goes on forever and ever and ever, just like God himself. On day 5, the first living thing God created was on day 3, but on day 5, that's the first day that God made any kind of animal. He made the aquatic creatures and the birds. Also talks about the sea monsters. And when he was done, interestingly enough, this is like maybe the one day where God didn't make a comment. Maybe he thought it was good, he just didn't say it was good. But pretty much every other day, he says it's good. And finally, we come to our part of the story, our ancestors. On day 6, God created all the land creatures, including mankind. He created all the insects, reptiles, cattle, all the beasts, all the ancestors of the felines and the canines, and all those things were made that day. And in verse 27, we read that God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female, he created them. In fact, all the animals were male and female so that they could reproduce and replenish the earth or fill the earth. Even some plants have a male and a female version of them. And in verse 28, he tells man that he wants them to be fruitful, multiply, that he puts them in charge of the earth. So he's really addressing man's stewardship of the planet. And in verse 29, it's interesting that originally humans were vegetarians. He says, God said, behold, I've given every green or every plant yielding seed that is on the surface of the earth, and every tree which has fruit yielding seed, it shall be food for you. And of course, he gave the food for the animals. So this brings up something interesting. A while back, it was just October 20th. Tim gave a sermon that I thought was really interesting. I'd never heard a sermon like this. as many years I've been a Christian, he gave a sermon about food. I don't know if you remember that. He gave a sermon about food and how food is interwoven in the Bible and how God uses food in the Bible to teach and to carry out his will. The name of the sermon was called Our Daily Bread. And he pointed out that eating is throughout the Bible, beginning right here in the very first chapter of Genesis. Talks about food for man and food for the animals. And it's interesting, he pointed out, I never thought about this, but sin entered the world not through some horrible crime, not through murder, not through kidnapping or rape or some act of violence, or not through stealing, but it was through eating something they were not supposed to eat. And I thought that was an interesting point. And then after the flood, the world was different in some ways. We don't know all the ways, but obviously things were different now. And with the new covenant with Noah, God allowed man to eat flesh as well. All things were edible with the exception of blood. There's something special about blood. We read, I think it was in Leviticus, where God said that the life is in the blood. We also know that in chapter 18, Abraham fed some angelic visitors to his home. And Esau sold his birthright for a stew because he was hungry. Also later, Jacob deceived his father with food. And near the end of Genesis, Joseph's brothers eat after they conspired to kill their brother. And then many years later, Joseph gave a lavish banquet for them. It's a little bit ironic. So in many ways, food is interwoven through the Bible story. All right, so chapter 1 was creation. Now we're finally graduating on to chapter 2 about Adam and Eve. One of the things that I would like to do, if I could, maybe in our last class, I'm going to see if I can give you like maybe a 1 or 2 word summary of each chapter of the Bible. So like 1 would be creation, number 2 either would be mankind or maybe Adam and Eve. Chapter 3 would be like the fall of man. Chapter 4 would be Cain and Abel, and so on. Maybe I can try to do that. So here's a summary of chapter 2. First of all, chapter 1, verse 1 and 2:1 are really bookends. Chapter 1 says, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. 2:1 says, thus the heavens and the earth were created and all their hosts. So in a way, it's just really, verse 1 here is just a summary of what happened on those first 6 days. And at the tail end of chapter 2, we read about the creation of man very briefly. And now with chapter 2, we're zeroing in with the spiritual microscope here, and we're focusing more detail about that creation of man. In verses 2 and 3, it says that God took a respite from his creation on the seventh day, and later on we get to the Mosaic covenant. We see that idea of 6 days of creation is partly what's behind the idea of the Sabbath day. And so if there were not 6 literal days of creation, it kind of wouldn't make as much sense to have the Sabbath day. In verses 5 and 6, we read that at least at this time, there was no rain. There was a mist. It says in verse 6, a mist used to rise from the earth and water the whole surface of the ground. Now, it makes you kind of wonder, was there ever rain before the flood, or was there just simply a mist? Because it kind of makes me wonder when Noah told people that the rain and the flood was coming, obviously the scale of it would have made people skeptical, but I wonder if they had never seen rain before. If he said, yeah, there's going to be raindrops, there's going to be drops of water just falling from the sky, and that probably would have been a ridiculous idea because nobody had ever seen that before. That's not how the world worked in their day and age. Maybe, I guess we don't know for absolute sure. In verse 7, Adam is created, and we know he was created from the dust of the earth, and God breathed life into Adam. And he puts him in the garden in verse 9. he mentions about what he can eat from the garden, but there's two very unique trees. One is called the tree of life, and the other is called the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And that tree is discussed later on again in verses 16 and 17. Now, in verses 10 through 14, it goes into a lot of detail here about these rivers that are flowing out of Eden. And I'm not really sure why, but it talks a lot about the gold and precious stones and so on. It's just that once the flood came, I'm sure it wiped out these rivers, but the names of them are continued on. For example, the Euphrates River, for example, is mentioned here. So I don't know, maybe they decided to keep that name even after the flood. And then focusing on that tree of knowledge of good and evil in verses 16 and 17. One of the things that was mentioned in the video here was that God was giving man a choice. It's kind of hard to say exactly what that tree of knowledge of good and evil was all about, or the tree of life. Were they literal trees? Some people might say, well, no, this was more of an allegory. Probably for our salvation or something, we probably don't really need to know the details. I'm inclined to believe they were just literal trees. Now, there may not be a special species of that, but maybe it could have been just an ordinary tree, but God may have just designated that and say, this particular tree here, I'm calling this the tree of life, or this is the knowledge of good and evil. And perhaps, I don't know, perhaps as a way to test man or something, but he said, I don't want you to eat of this tree. And by eating of it, God would see maybe know good and evil in a way that he was not meant to experience. In other words, up to that point, he was sinless, and he really didn't know, he didn't have firsthand experience of sin. But after he and Eve ate of the tree, now they had experienced evil, they had committed evil, and now they had a knowledge or familiarity with it that they did not have before that. And maybe that's what's involved there. Someone once said that God gave us enough intelligence that we would have questions, but not so much that we would have all the answers. I know I've already brought up in this course several questions that I had about God, and we're not done yet. There's a few more questions that are coming up, and they're just put out there. Maybe you have your own thoughts, and we'll probably never have the answers until this life is over. Actually, that does get me to a question here. I wonder, why did God put these two trees in the garden? And I just kind of wonder, if there's a tree of the knowledge of good and evil, if God didn't want Adam to eat of it, why did he put it there? It's almost, again, I'm as my mortal mind, I'm trying to wrap my head around this. It's almost as if you're living with an alcoholic and you're putting up the bottle of rum and whiskey right there on the counter in the kitchen, and it's there every day, and you say, now, make sure you don't drink this, okay? And every day you're putting out wine and stuff. You say, now, make sure you don't drink that, okay? And it puzzles me a little bit, other than maybe God was giving Adam and Eve the ability to make choices, instead of just being programmed like a robot to automatically follow God so they could not sin. He gave man a very precious gift, but it comes with a huge responsibility, and that is the freedom to make choices, to choose good and evil. And maybe that's why it was there. Another question that comes to mind, and this one I just don't have a good answer for, but I believe God is not limited to the timeline like you and I are, as I said in a previous class. God is really outside of the human timeline. He can see all times at the same, simultaneously. And I would assume that God knows all things. God would know that if he creates man with the ability to have free will, that sooner or later one of them is going to sin. One of them is going to choose not to do that. I figure if Adam and Eve hadn't sinned, then they probably would have sinned later, and if they hadn't done it, somewhere sooner or later, one of their descendants probably would have chosen to disobey God. So I think it was almost eventual. I mean, and so I wonder, if God created man knowing that man would sin someday, why did he do it? And knowing that some would be lost and they would never be following God, and I wonder, why would he create man? I don't know. Unless maybe because of in his power, maybe somehow he could choose to withhold that knowledge from him and leave it open. Because I remember, when Jesus, during the days of his flesh, he said something like about the end of the world. He said, no one knows when that day's going to come. And if I remember right, he even said, even the Son of Man doesn't know when that's come. Only the Father knows that. And so it tells me how could one part of the Godhead not know what the other part of the Godhead is doing? So maybe it suggests the possibility, at least, that God created man, but maybe decided not to know what the outcome of that would be. But then again, it seemed like he already had a plan in place. And we read that even from the foundation of the world, that God had this plan to redeem lost humanity. Now, exactly when he came up with that, we don't know, but it just says from the foundation of the world. So again, that's one of those questions that comes up, and I don't know if there's really a good answer for it. And we just have to, understand that, the good about God is greater than the things that I don't know. The good about God that I do know is greater than the good about God that I don't know. So I just have to take it on faith that God knows what he's doing, and he did the right thing. In verse 18, Adam is all alone. Think about it, he's the only human being on the entire planet. Can you imagine what that would have been like? Kind of reminds me, there's this movie, I think it's called Omega Man with Charlton Heston. I don't know, maybe you've seen that, where he's like the only survivor of some catastrophe. I just can't imagine being the only person, but he's alone. And we read in the next few verses that God realizes he finally did something. All this time God says this is good. And in fact, I didn't mention, but when he ceased creation, he said it's very good. He really liked what he made. But here's the first time we said, you know what, this is not good. But see, God knew this all along. It's not like God was surprised to go, oh, what did I do? He had this all planned out ahead of time. He said it's not good. He said, I will make a helper suitable for him. Well, he could have done this different ways. He could have made Eve out of the dust. He could have just made her immediately. As soon as he made Adam, he could have made her. But he didn't do it that way, did he? Do you remember what he does? He starts parading the animals before him. It says in verse 19, out of the ground the Lord God formed every beast of the field and every bird of the sky. So apparently on those days of creation when he created the animals, he did it the same way he did with Adam. He made them out of the dirt. And he brought them before Adam, and Adam gave names to all the animals. You can only wonder what language did Adam speak, but apparently he had the capability of language. And at the end of verse 20 it says, for Adam there was not found a helper suitable for him. Don't you suppose that some of this was for Adam's benefit? I think God could have just made Eve right on the spot, but I think he was trying to get Adam to appreciate something, that there's something missing, and none of these animals is really suitable for you. None of these animals can work with you and have a relationship with you and communicate with you. There's just something that they can't do for you. So I think by doing this, I think Adam became more aware of how alone he was and how there was something missing in his life. And so I'm sure it was all a purpose behind it. Well, we have the first record of surgery being performed. God was the surgeon. He opened up Adam's rib cage and created woman out of the rib from Adam. And again, he could have done this all different ways. He could have probably could have brought her into existence out of thin air. He could have brought her out of the dust. But instead, he chose to take a part of his body and make woman from a part of his body. And let's see. I might have, no, sorry, I thought I had a verse here. But in 1 Timothy 2:13, we read that it was Adam who was created, or first created, and then Eve. Now, that just tells us that in the New Testament, it's backing up what we read here in Genesis. If this isn't really how it happened, the New Testament could have clarified that and said, well, you know, what you read, that was just an allegory, that was just an illustration, it didn't really happen that way. But none other than the Apostle Paul, inspired writer, is saying that's exactly how it happened. So if we believe the New Testament, then we should believe the Old Testament. And they're told they're going to be one flesh. We have basically the institution of marriage. And you know, it's kind of interesting that if you look at all societies, it seemed like almost all of them have some kind of a ritual or ceremony for when a man and a woman come together in a special bond that we call marriage. Now, in the Bible, there's no guideline as to what that ceremony should look like. They leave it up to culture, but there seems to be something that's universal among humans, that when a man and woman come together, there's a special bond. Even in polygamous societies, there seems to be something where they realize there's just something about that relationship that's special, and they become one flesh. In 1971, Paul Stuckey of the group Peter, Paul, and Mary released a song called The Wedding Song, There Is Love. And there's a beautiful stanza from that song that harkens back to this very event. So I was telling you how in our culture, even now, today, in our culture, there are many references back to what things that happened in Genesis. And in that song, he says, well, a man shall leave his mother and a woman leave her home. They shall travel on where the two shall be as one. As it was in the beginning, is now until the end, woman draws her life from man and gives it back again. And there is love, there is love. And I think that's so fitting that woman does draw her life or existence from man's rib, but in turn, she gives life to man through the process of childbirth. None other than our Lord Jesus also made reference to this event back in Matthew 19, verses 4 through 6. Jesus is talking about this divorce here, and this is the context. But Jesus said, have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female? And said, for this cause a man shall leave his father and mother and shall cleave to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. Consequently, they are no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let no man separate. So Jesus is quoting right here from the book of Genesis. So I figure if we believe Jesus, then we probably should believe the Genesis story. All right, so we got ourselves through chapter 2. Unfortunately, things went downhill in short order. We don't really know how long Adam was living before Eve was created. I have a hunch it was more than just a few hours, or maybe in a few days. Just me, I'm thinking it was probably days, if not weeks, maybe months, to give him plenty of time to realize how alone he was and how much he really needed Eve in his life. Likewise, we're not really told how long Adam and Eve were living together in this union before things started to go bad. We're introduced to the serpent or the snake, and this one can talk. And do you know there are only two animals that are recorded as talking to humans in the Bible. This is one of them. The other one is Balaam's donkey in Numbers 22. And the serpent, references to the serpent shows up again in the book of Revelation. As I said, Genesis and Revelation are really bookends of each other. Whatever was lost in Genesis is restored in the book of Revelation. So they're very much complementary to each other. And there are references to the serpent or the dragon as being Satan. And here's something I thought was interesting. that as pivotal as Satan is to this story, he's only mentioned here in the book of Genesis. He's only mentioned in chapter 3. He's not mentioned anywhere else in the book. Now, obviously, his influence is behind the scenes, right? He's working in the nations and people's lives, but he's not mentioned by name here. And, well, I'll just leave it at that. So we know that the serpent persuaded Eve to take of the fruit, and what he did, he cast doubt. And you know, the interesting thing, too, about the way the devil works, we've all sinned at some point in our life, but you know, the devil cannot physically take our hand and force us to do something with our hand we're not supposed to do. He can't take our feet and make us walk and go somewhere we are not supposed to go. He can't get into our mind and force us to think about something that we don't want to think about. Right? He cannot do that. He cannot force us to do anything we are not a willing party to do. And so he uses like temptation, he uses deceit, he tries to cast doubt. Those are kind of the tools that he uses in his little toolkit. And he knows your weak spots. My weak spots are not the same as your weak spots, but he knows where they are, and he knows how to apply pressure there on that weak spot over and over again until you finally give in or you have a weak moment. So he's casting doubt here, and he says, oh, God said this to you? Well, no, it's not really true. Now, I know sometimes maybe people give Adam and Eve a hard time, but if you think about it, I mean, they had never seen sin before. They didn't know what a world of sin looked like. They were almost, I would guess they're probably like children in some ways. They may have been in adult bodies, but they were probably very naive. You know, they didn't grow up seeing all the stuff that you and I have grown up seeing in the world. So I could kind of see where they were probably easy prey for the devil. They were very easy to beguile. Hopefully now we're not so easy, but he's got his own tricks for us. So anyway, so Eve sinned, and then Adam, and I think I have, well, actually, I'm going to get to this in a little bit. Again, in 1 Timothy 2:14, it says, it was not Adam who was deceived, but the woman was deceived and became a wrongdoer. And I wanted to compare Genesis 3:6 to 1 John 2:16. They're almost like word for word. I think when the Apostle John wrote this statement, I'm just about certain that he had in mind Genesis 3:6. Because in Genesis 3:6 it says, when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, it's a little hard to read it from here, that the tree was good for food, or I'll just read it here. That it was good for food, and that it was a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was desirable to make one wise. She took from its fruit and ate, and she gave also to her husband with her, and he ate. And so, in a way, there's like three aspects of sin that John addresses also. Again, it appeals to the lust of the flesh. So by that, it's like what feels good to us, the sensual pleasures of the flesh. And another thing that can tempt us is what looks good. You know, humans are very visually oriented. And so things that appeal, whether it's sexual appeal or aesthetic appeal or maybe clothing, whatever it may be, things that appeal to our eyes can also lead us to sin. And then finally, things that deal with our vanity, our pride, our arrogance, maybe something that we might think will make us popular or powerful or have control over other people. Those are the things that also can lead us to temptation. And if you think about just about any sin that we commit, probably stems from one of those three things. Maybe you can think of something that doesn't, but I bet a lot of sins come from that. And then we read about the curse, which I'm not going to go, but in the video they mention in verse 3:15 about this is the first prophecy of God coming up with a plan to save lost humanity. And then let's go down to verse 21. It says, the Lord God made garments of skin for Adam and his wife and clothed them. And I don't know if you ever thought about it before, but I think that's very interesting. Trying to find, I guess I didn't put it in my notes here, but this is the first record of an animal dying. I don't think animals were originally meant to die, but this is the first record of an animal to die, and it was a sacrifice for the benefit of the humans. So here we have the first example of an animal being sacrificed, shedding its blood, giving something of itself in order to cover the humans. And in a sense, it's kind of like it points to the idea that when we sin, we are naked before God, and we should be embarrassed or ashamed for our nakedness, and we need a sacrifice to cover us and to clothe us. In Galatians 3:27, the Apostle Paul says that all of you who have been baptized into Christ have clothed yourself with Christ. And so, it really fits very much back to this. All right. Oh, here we go. Okay, this is a summary, I guess. It was Adam who was first created, and then Eve, and it was not Adam who was deceived, but the woman was deceived. So it's almost like she deceived, but it's almost like Adam went into this with his eyes wide open. It's almost like Adam knew what he was doing. And then, of course, we have the tragic results here, as I've said. So there's that statement in Galatians 3:27, for all of you who were baptized into Christ have clothed yourself with Christ. And not only that, but they were kicked out of the garden. They were forced to leave. So they lost paradise. When we go to the book of Revelation, we see that paradise was regained. All right. Well, in chapter 4, we now have Cain and Abel. We see, again, another first. There's a lot of firsts in the book of Genesis. This is the first account of childbirth. And you know, there probably were no midwives there. They probably didn't have much in the way of anesthetic. So I don't know how it went for Eve, but she got the first taste of it. And this is the first account of worship in the Bible. In verse 3, it says that it came about in the course of due time that Cain brought forth an offering to the Lord of the fruit of the ground. Now, was this something he thought of himself, or did God tell him to bring a sacrifice? We don't really know, but apparently it was the first account of worship. We wonder, well, where did this idea originate? It seems like almost every culture has some notion of worship. Have you noticed that? I mean, almost every culture worships a god or gods or some kind of a deity, and many religions have a component that involves a sacrifice or some kind of offering to that deity or offering to that spirit, maybe to appease that spirit. So where is that? That's embedded deeply in the human psyche. And the nature of true worship is described by Jesus to that woman in the well, about worshiping in spirit and in truth. And Cain's offering was rejected, and we might wonder why, and there's possible reasons. Maybe he just simply had the wrong attitude. Maybe he was grudging, maybe he was stingy, maybe he had the leftovers, maybe the crummy part of his crop. He said, well, I'm not going to use this anyway. I'll probably throw it out, so I'll, instead of wasting it, I'll go ahead and offer that to God. Okay, so he had the wrong attitude, maybe because he didn't want to, or he didn't want to give his best. Leftovers, poor quality. Or maybe his offering didn't consist of the items that God had instructed him to do. Maybe he was substituting something else. Maybe he gave something of the fruit of the ground, but it wasn't the thing that God told him to give. You may remember the story of Nadab and Abihu. They offered strange fire for a sacrifice. Now, fire is fire, right? It's burning. But it was important to God that it wasn't just something you get from like a Bic lighter or a match. It had to be fire that originated from a particular source. Or maybe it wasn't performed according to the way that God instructed. Now, I remember a long time ago I gave a lesson where I said it was because God preferred an animal sacrifice with blood, not a grain sacrifice. And one of the elders corrected me and said, you know, it really doesn't say that. In fact, there are some grain sacrifices among the Hebrews. So I wouldn't say it was necessarily because of that, but there was something wrong in the spirit it was done. And I think we can see that later on that there was something wrong with Cain's spirit. And of course, he was angry, he was jealous of his brother's favor, and he was even kind of a smart aleck toward God in verse 9. All right, we're going to have to close it out today. We will resume chapter 4, and obviously you can see where things are going here. You know the story, right? You know things already went bad with Adam and Eve, and I'm afraid it's not getting better with the two brothers here, okay? It's going to go downhill. So